The sun sets behind the trees, casting long shadows over the path ahead. You've heard the stories. Black Hollow Forest, a place where the very air hums with dark secrets. But no one really believes in the myths, right? That is, until you find yourself in the middle of it. What if the legends aren't just stories? What if there really is something lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting? Tonight, we're diving into a true survival tale. A young woman named Emma who stumbles into a nightmare she can't escape, or can she? In this terrifying journey through Black Hollow Forest, Emma will face creatures beyond imagination. And the question is, can she make it out alive, or will the forest claim her soul? But here's the catch. What Emma doesn't know is that even if she survives the night, something far more terrifying waits beyond the trees. Stick around to the end because you won't believe what happens next. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed because you won't want to miss what happens next. Hit the like button if you're already on the edge of your seat, and share this with someone brave enough to join you on this chilling journey. Ready? Then let's step into the shadows together. The sun was setting as Emma pulled into the gravel parking lot at the edge of Black Hollow Forest. Her car's headlights illuminated a weathered sign that read, "Enter at your own risk." Its letters faded and cracked. She snapped a picture of it on her phone, making a mental note to include it in her article. Perfect introduction, she thought. Emma had spent weeks poring over local legends about this forest. Stories of shadowy figures and strange disappearances filled the pages of her research journal. Her editor had laughed when she pitched the story, calling it a Halloween gimmick, but Emma saw it differently. Folklore had always fascinated her, and these tales of creatures in the dark resonated more deeply than most. As she stepped out of her car, the chill of the evening air wrapped around her. Black Hollow Forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, only the faint hum of her car engine as it cooled. She hesitated for a moment, her gaze drifting to the dense trees ahead, their silhouettes stark against the dim orange sky. Folklore or not, people still live here, she murmured to herself, trying to shake the unease settling in her chest. At the gas station a few miles back, the attendant had warned her. A grizzled man with calloused hands and a perpetual scowl. He leaned across the counter and said, "Folks go missing in those woods, Missy. Not sure what you're looking for, but you might not like what you find." Emma dismissed it as small-town superstition, the kind of talk that kept urban legends alive. But now, standing at the forest's edge, his words felt heavier. She slung her backpack over her shoulder, adjusted the flashlight clipped to her pocket, and grabbed her notebook. Emma wasn't planning to stay long, just enough time to gather material for her story, snap a few photos, and maybe capture the eerie atmosphere she'd read so much about. As she crossed the threshold of the forest, the world seemed to change. The gravel under her boots gave way to soft earth, muffling her steps. Towering pines loomed overhead, their branches interlocking to form a canopy that blocked out what little sunlight remained. Emma's pulse quickened, though she couldn't pinpoint why. The rational part of her mind insisted that the stories she'd read were just that, stories. But there was something about the air here, dense and oppressive, that made her feel unwelcome. The first half-mile of her hike was uneventful, but she couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. She stopped to take a photo of a particularly gnarled tree, its roots twisted like claws gripping the earth. When she reviewed the image on her phone, she swore she saw something, a shadow maybe, lurking in the background. She shook her head. Just a trick of the light. As she ventured deeper, Emma noticed how the forest seemed to absorb sound. Her footsteps, the crunch of leaves, even her breathing felt muted. The only noise was the occasional groan of the wind through the trees. Finally, she reached a small clearing and paused to catch her breath. She pulled out her notebook and jotted down a few observations. Unnaturally quiet. Trees seem older here. Air smells metallic. Her pen hesitated above the page as a sudden rustling broke the silence. It was faint, coming from somewhere behind her. She spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. Probably just an animal, she muttered, though her voice wavered. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Emma glanced at her watch. Sunset had come and gone, and the forest was quickly being swallowed by darkness. She clipped the flashlight onto her jacket and switched it on, its beam cutting through the shadows. As she stood there, trying to steady her breathing, the forest seemed to close in around her. And for the first time, she wondered if she had made a mistake coming here alone. The rustling persisted, growing louder, closer. Emma's flashlight flickered as she scanned the clearing, her pulse quickening with each passing second. She strained her ears, hoping to pinpoint the source, but the forest seemed to play tricks on her. The sound echoed and shifted, surrounding her. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaky. The word barely carried, swallowed by the oppressive stillness. Her mind raced through possibilities, an animal, maybe a deer, or a prankster who'd followed her from the gas station. She tightened her grip on the flashlight, the cold metal slick against her palm. Then, as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. The silence was almost worse. Emma's chest heaved as she struggled to control her breathing. She waited, her feet rooted to the spot, but nothing moved. She considered turning back. The idea of retreating to the safety of her car felt more appealing with each passing second. But she shook her head. You didn't come all this way to scare yourself out of a story. Taking a deep breath, Emma pressed on, her steps cautious and deliberate. The flashlight's beam danced across the forest floor, illuminating a path of fallen leaves and moss. 100 yards deeper into the woods, she stumbled across something that made her stomach churn. Claw marks gouged into the bark of a tree, deep and deliberate, as if made by something with tremendous strength. The scratches ran vertically, stretching far higher than she could reach. She placed a hand against the bark, her fingers trembling as she traced the grooves. "Bear?" she whispered to herself, though the thought didn't sit right. Bears weren't known for such methodical markings, and these scratches felt wrong, too deliberate. She took a picture, her hands unsteady as she framed the shot. The flash of her phone lit up the surrounding trees for a split second, and in that brief moment, she thought she saw a shape. A humanoid silhouette, tall and gaunt, lurking just beyond her flashlight's range. Emma spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, but the figure was gone. "It's your imagination," she muttered, trying to calm herself. "The shadows, the trees, that's all it is." But deep down, she wasn't convinced. The air grew colder as she continued, and the metallic tang in the atmosphere became stronger. It clung to the back of her throat, making her cough. Her boots crunched over something brittle, and when she looked down, she saw scattered bones, small, like those of a bird or rodent. Emma's unease deepened. She paused to jot down her observations. Claw marks on trees, bones scattered, metallic smell growing stronger. Possible hallucinations, figure in shadows. She hesitated before adding, local legends may hold some truth. Her flashlight's beam caught something ahead. A small clearing, the faint remnants of a campsite visible in the dim light. She approached cautiously, her footsteps slow and deliberate. The campsite was a wreck. A tent lay collapsed, its fabric torn and shredded. A sleeping bag was tossed aside, covered in dirt and leaves. Nearby, a rusted lantern stood upright, its glass shattered. Emma knelt beside the remains, examining them closely. Whoever had camped here had left in a hurry, or something had forced them to flee. She picked up a small object near the fire pit. A carved talisman made of bone, its edges worn smooth. The design was crude but unmistakable, a warding symbol she'd seen in her research. Her breath caught in her throat. "This can't be real," she whispered, holding the talisman up to the light. But the weight of it in her hand told her otherwise. Someone had left it here, likely in desperation. The forest seemed to close in around her as she stood there, talisman in hand. The air felt heavier, pressing against her chest like a physical weight. And then she heard it again, that rustling, louder this time, unmistakably deliberate. She spun around, her flashlight darting through the darkness. The beam caught movement, something low to the ground, darting between the trees. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. No response. The rustling stopped, replaced by a low growl that sent shivers racing down her spine. It sounded close, too close. Emma stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the collapsed tent. She clutched the talisman tightly, its edges digging into her palm. As the growl grew louder, her flashlight flickered again, the beam wavering. "Stay calm," she told herself, her voice barely a whisper. But the rising panic in her chest was impossible to ignore. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the growling stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a moment, Emma thought she might have imagined it. But as she stood there, frozen in the darkness, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Emma pressed forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air was thick, suffocating, and the cold seemed to seep through her jacket and into her bones. The talisman she'd found remained clutched tightly in her hand, its crude design a small but tangible comfort. Her flashlight beam carved a narrow path through the shadows, but the darkness beyond seemed alive, shifting and pulsing just out of reach. Every so often, she would pause, straining her ears for any sound beyond her own cautious footsteps. The forest refused to give her peace. A sharp crack rang out, shattering the oppressive silence. Emma froze, her breath caught in her throat. The sound hadn't come from behind her, as she'd half expected. It came from somewhere ahead. She moved slowly, cautiously, towards the source, the beam of her flashlight jittering with each unsteady step. As she crept closer, her light fell on something unusual. A set of deep footprints pressed into the soft earth. Kneeling beside them, Emma traced the edges with her fingers. They were massive, far larger than any human foot, and the shape was all wrong, elongated, with clawed tips that had gouged the ground. Her pulse quickened as she realized these weren't just random impressions. They were a trail. Whatever made these, it's still out here, she thought, her stomach twisting. She followed the tracks despite every instinct screaming at her to turn back. Curiosity warred with fear, and for now, curiosity won. The trail led her to another clearing, smaller and even more unsettling than the first. The claw marks she'd seen earlier were here too, but these trees bore something worse. Long, deliberate gashes marred their trunks, and the bark seemed to ooze a dark, sap-like substance. The smell was overpowering, a mix of decay and metal. Emma's light caught something on the ground. Scattered bones, much larger than the ones she'd seen earlier. These were unmistakably from a deer, their marrow hollowed out as if drained. A shiver ran down her spine. She stood there, frozen, until movement in her peripheral vision snapped her back to attention. She turned her flashlight quickly, the beam cutting through the dark, and that's when she saw it. At first, it was just a shape, a tall, skeletal figure standing impossibly still among the trees. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its body emaciated, and its glowing eyes burned like embers in the night. Emma's breath hitched. She didn't dare move, afraid that even the slightest twitch would draw its attention. But the creature seemed already aware of her, tilting its head as if studying her. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself, though her voice was barely audible over the pounding of her heart. The creature took a single step forward, its movement jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on tangled strings. Emma stumbled backward, her flashlight shaking violently in her hands. She tripped over a root, falling hard onto her back, and the flashlight slipped from her grip. Darkness swallowed her. The sound of her own breathing filled her ears, each ragged gasp a reminder of how vulnerable she was. She scrambled to retrieve the flashlight, her fingers fumbling in the dirt. When she finally found it and clicked it back on, the beam landed directly on the creature's face. It recoiled with a guttural hiss, its glowing eyes narrowing to slits. Emma didn't wait to see what it would do next. She scrambled to her feet and ran, adrenaline propelling her forward as branches whipped against her face and arms. The forest seemed endless, the trees blurring together as she sprinted blindly through the dark. Behind her, she could hear the creature's heavy, uneven footsteps, the sound of its claws scraping against the ground. It was toying with her. She could feel it. Her lungs burned, and her legs felt like lead. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. The primal urge to survive overrode everything else. Finally, Emma broke through another clearing and collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. The creature's footsteps had stopped, but she knew better than to think she was safe. She shone her flashlight wildly, scanning the perimeter, but the forest offered no answers. A low growl resonated from the shadows, chilling her to the core. It wasn't far. Emma clutched the talisman tightly, its sharp edges digging into her palm. She wasn't sure if it offered any real protection, but at this point, she was willing to believe in anything. The growl grew louder, closer, and Emma felt her resolve falter. For the first time, she realized she might not make it out of Black Hollow Forest alive. Emma stumbled to her feet, her body shaking uncontrollably. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead, heavy and uncooperative. Her breath came in short, desperate gasps as she scanned the shadows, her flashlight flickering in her trembling hand. The growl had stopped, but the eerie silence that followed was even worse. She couldn't tell if the creature had lost interest or if it was still watching her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She didn't want to find out. Move, Emma. Just keep moving. Her legs wobbled beneath her, but she forced herself to take a step, then another. The forest around her was alive with sounds. Branches creaking in the wind, leaves rustling underfoot. But none of it mattered. Every sound now felt like a trap, like it was closing in on her, pushing her deeper into the woods. She tried to calm herself, tried to think rationally. You've been in worse situations. But no matter how many times she told herself that, the pounding in her chest wouldn't stop. Her eyes darted from shadow to shadow, searching for any sign of movement. The forest felt claustrophobic, the trees pressing in on her from all sides. Every rustle of the leaves sent her heart into overdrive, and every step felt like it could be her last. She needed a way out. With every turn, every step she took, the forest seemed to change, becoming more twisted, more unfamiliar. The trees that had once seemed so ordinary now looked like gnarled, skeletal figures, their branches reaching out like fingers, clawing at her. The ground beneath her feet had turned soft and spongy, as though the earth itself was trying to swallow her whole. Her flashlight flickered again, casting strange, jittery shadows across the darkened forest floor. She quickly smacked it, desperate to keep it working. A sudden noise made her freeze in her tracks. A low, scraping sound, like something dragging across the ground, came from just ahead of her. Emma didn't even think. She spun on her heels, her flashlight illuminating a thick, twisted root that had snaked out across the path. For a moment, she thought it was just the forest playing tricks on her. But then she heard it again, the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against the earth. It's closer. She broke into a frantic run, her breath ragged, her heart pounding in her ears. The flashlight was still flickering in her hand, but now it felt like a useless weight. She could barely focus on where she was going, her vision clouded by panic and the creeping sense of doom that clung to her like a second skin. Branches slapped against her face, and the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, followed her every move. She knew it was the creature, trailing her, savoring the hunt. The further she ran, the more disoriented she became. The forest had become a labyrinth, twisting and shifting with no clear path forward. Every direction looked the same. Endless trees, thick underbrush, and shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. A sharp pain shot through her ankle, and she collapsed to the ground with a cry. She twisted her body, trying to push herself back to her feet, but the pain in her leg was intense, blurring her thoughts. She couldn't stop now. She couldn't afford to slow down. Her hand brushed against something cold and metallic, her flashlight. She grabbed it, gripping it so tightly her knuckles ached, and forced herself up. Keep moving. Keep moving. But as she hobbled forward, the air around her began to thicken, the scent of metal and decay overpowering. She felt it, the presence of something dark, watching her from the shadows. The growling was louder now, closer, and she knew with a chilling certainty that it was no longer just playing with her. It was closing in for the kill. Desperation clawed at her throat as she stumbled forward, fighting through the pain in her leg. She had to find a way out. She had to. And then, in the distance, she saw it. Something that didn't belong in the forest. A flicker of light, faint but unmistakable, like the glow of a lantern. Could it be a person? The thought barely registered before she found herself moving toward it, driven by the hope that maybe, just maybe, someone else was out there. Maybe they could help. Her heart surged as she moved faster, pushing herself beyond her limits. But the growling came again, louder now, almost deafening. It wasn't just following her. It was surrounding her. She looked back, half expecting to see the creature in full pursuit. But instead, all she saw was darkness. A void that seemed to stretch out forever. The lantern light flickered once more, and Emma's breath hitched. She was so close. She had to be. But then the ground beneath her feet gave way. Her foot caught on something, an exposed root, and she tumbled forward, crashing into the ground. The world spun around her, and before she could regain her senses, a heavy weight pressed down on her chest, pinning her to the dirt. Her flashlight flew from her hand, its beam cutting across the forest floor one last time. And then, everything went dark. Emma's breath was ragged, sharp gasps that echoed in the oppressive silence. Her chest heaved as she tried to move, but the weight pressing down on her felt too much, too solid, too real. Panic surged through her as she tried to free herself, but her limbs refused to obey. She couldn't move. Something cold, slick, and heavy slid against her skin. It smelled like rot, like something ancient and forgotten, and Emma's heart hammered in her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to fight, but her body was sluggish, too slow. Her mind raced, desperately trying to latch onto anything that might help her. The talisman. She reached out for it, her hand trembling as she brushed the dirt and leaves away from her body. But the small bone charm was nowhere to be found. The growl rumbled low, vibrating the air around her. The creature was close. She could feel its presence, like a dark cloud surrounding her, suffocating her. It's going to kill me. The thought was terrifying in its finality, and for a moment, Emma felt the weight of it. Like the forest itself had grown too large, too alive, and was swallowing her whole. Her mind flashed to the legends she'd read, the warnings, the creatures that lurked in the shadows. Was this the Wendigo? A skinwalker? She had no way of knowing, but the terror she felt was all too real. But then something else shifted. Something within her snapped. Emma's breath steadied as a strange, almost calm clarity settled over her. She was terrified, yes, but she wasn't helpless. Not yet. With all the strength she had left, she pushed against the ground, her hands scraping against the rough dirt. She didn't know what she was reaching for, but she needed to find something, anything. Her fingers brushed something cold and hard, a rock, sharp-edged and jagged. She grasped it tightly, feeling its weight in her hand. The growl grew louder, almost as if the creature was mocking her, savoring her struggle. But she wasn't about to give up. Not now. With a scream that tore from her throat, Emma swung the rock blindly, striking at the air around her. The impact made a sickening, hollow sound, like hitting flesh, but the growl stopped. Still here. The thought flickered through her mind, but she didn't stop. She swung the rock again, this time in the direction of the sound. There was a hiss, sharp and jagged, and then the weight on her chest lifted, almost as if the creature had been thrown back. Emma scrambled to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her as she took in ragged breaths. Her flashlight was still somewhere in the dirt, flickering weakly, but she didn't need it. She knew the creature was still near. She could feel it watching her, the chill of its presence sinking into her bones. Think, what can I do? The answer came in a flash, an image from one of the many folktales she had read, wards, symbols, ancient protections. The talisman. The creature seemed to be repelled by it, terrified by the crude symbol she had found earlier. Emma scanned the forest floor, her eyes wild, searching for anything that might serve as a barrier. There, a small clearing just ahead. She didn't hesitate. She sprinted towards it, ignoring the pain in her legs, the exhaustion, the terror that still clawed at her. Behind her, she could hear the creature's growls growing louder, more insistent. As she reached the clearing, she stumbled to a stop, her heart racing. The air felt colder here, the darkness even thicker. But she couldn't stop now. She needed to defend herself. Her hand shot into her pocket and she pulled out the talisman. It felt warm in her hand, pulsing almost, as though alive with energy. She held it aloft, focusing all her fear, all her will, into the simple bone charm. For a moment nothing happened. Then, the air seemed to shift, the forest groaning, and a high-pitched screech filled the air, so sharp it made her ears ring. The creature was here. Emma could feel its presence, creeping just beyond the edge of the clearing. It was waiting, watching. She wasn't sure if the talisman would work, but she had to try. She had to believe. With all the strength she had left, Emma raised the talisman higher, chanting the crude words she had memorized from the folklore she'd read. The words felt foreign on her tongue, ancient and harsh, but as she spoke them, the creature shrieked again, this time in pain. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and a shadow, vast and unnatural, rose from the forest floor. It was the creature, its shape warping and twisting as it retreated into the darkness. Emma's heart thundered in her chest as she dropped to her knees, exhausted, breathless. The pain in her legs had returned, and her hands shook violently. But the creature was gone. For now, the forest was still. The oppressive weight had lifted, but Emma knew better than to believe it was over. The legends had warned her of creatures that lurked, waiting for a chance to strike. But for the first time in hours, Emma felt the fragile hope that she might just survive this night. She wasn't safe yet, but she had fought and won this battle. Emma's hands were slick with sweat, her entire body trembling from exhaustion. She sat on the cold ground, her breath ragged, as the eerie silence of Black Hollow Forest wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket. The talisman still rested in her palm, its warmth fading, but it had done its job for now. The creature had retreated, its screams fading into the distance. But the fear that gnawed at her insides remained. "It's not over." The thought echoed in her mind like a warning bell. She couldn't relax, not yet. Emma forced herself to her feet, her legs wobbly, each movement painful. The adrenaline that had carried her this far was wearing thin, leaving her drained. She felt the weight of the night pressing down on her, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. She had to move. Looking around, she could see the dark outlines of the trees, their twisted branches reaching for her like skeletal hands. The forest had become a maze, and every direction seemed to lead her deeper into its heart. But Emma had no choice. She couldn't stay here. The feeling of being watched, of something just beyond her reach, clung to her. She wasn't alone. Her pulse quickened as she began to walk, forcing her legs to move despite the exhaustion. The distant growl of the creature still echoed in the back of her mind, but it had faded, leaving behind only the oppressive silence. Every step she took felt like it could be her last. She couldn't let her guard down. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts: desperation, fear, survival. The forest had become an enemy, a labyrinth that seemed to shift with each passing moment. Emma wasn't sure how much longer she could keep going. She didn't even know where she was heading. But then, just as her hope began to wane, she saw it. A faint glimmer of light through the trees. It wasn't much, but it was enough to ignite a spark of hope in her chest. She pushed herself forward, ignoring the thorns that scratched at her skin, the branches that grabbed at her arms. The light grew stronger, clearer, and with it the sound of voices. People. Her heart skipped a beat, but she didn't slow down. She wasn't sure who they were, but if they were human, they could help her. She could make it out of this cursed forest. The clearing came into view, and Emma stumbled into it, her eyes frantically searching for the source of the light. She froze when she saw the lanterns, several of them hanging from the trees, casting an eerie glow on the scene in front of her. But there were no people. The clearing was empty. A knot formed in Emma's stomach as she scanned the area. The lanterns swayed gently in the wind, casting long shadows across the ground. It felt wrong, like something was off. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw the shape in the center of the clearing. A figure stood there, cloaked in tattered black robes, its face hidden beneath a hood. The air around it seemed to shimmer, as though reality itself was warping. Emma's heart raced, but she couldn't turn away. She didn't know why she was drawn to the figure, but something deep within her told her that it had the answers she needed. The figure raised a hand, and in that instant, Emma felt a surge of power ripple through the clearing. The talisman in her hand burned, its warmth intensifying, and she instinctively gripped it tighter. "You're not supposed to be here," a voice whispered, barely audible over the wind. Emma's eyes widened. The figure hadn't moved its lips, yet the words had been clear in her mind. The figure tilted its head, as if studying her, before it spoke again. "Leave this place, girl. You don't belong in this forest. No one does." A cold chill ran through Emma's body, but she refused to back down. I just want to get out of here. I'm not looking for trouble." Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to speak. The figure's hood shifted, revealing nothing but darkness beneath. The air thickened with an otherworldly pressure. Emma felt like she was suffocating, but she couldn't move. "The forest is not your enemy," the voice said, its tone like a whisper on the wind. "But you have awakened something that has been dormant for too long. The creature you fear is only one of many. The forest itself is alive, and it will not let you leave." Emma's stomach churned. She had known it wasn't over. She had known the forest would fight back. "Then what do I do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure was silent for a moment, as if considering her question. Then it extended a hand, and Emma felt an overwhelming sense of calm wash over her. You must face the forest. Only then can you escape. Before Emma could react, the figure turned, vanishing into the shadows like smoke. The clearing was silent once more, the lanterns flickering as if nothing had happened. Emma stood there for a long moment, her thoughts swirling. What did it mean to face the forest? And what was she supposed to do now? The creature was still out there. The forest was still hunting her. But now Emma felt like she had a purpose. With the talisman clenched tightly in her hand, she turned and began to move once more. She didn't know where she was going, but she had no choice. She had to face whatever lay ahead, because the forest wasn't going to let her leave. The forest had become a living nightmare. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of twigs beneath her boots, seemed to echo with a hidden meaning, as if the trees themselves were watching her. The talisman in her hand felt heavier than before, the warmth pulsing with an urgency she couldn't explain. It was as though the forest was calling to it, or to her. Face the forest. The figure's words echoed in her mind, sending a chill down her spine. Emma had no idea what it meant, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't keep running. Not anymore. She had been running for hours, maybe longer, through the endless maze of trees, but each step only seemed to lead her deeper into the heart of the forest. There were no paths, no markers, just the suffocating weight of the trees and the growing sense of something watching her from just beyond the reach of her flashlight. Emma stopped and took a deep breath. She could feel it. The creature was near. It had been following her since she left the clearing, but she couldn't see it. Every now and then, she would catch a glimpse of movement, a flash of shadow, the crack of a branch, but it was never enough to truly see what was out there. Her heart raced as she looked around, every fiber of her being screaming at her to run. But where to? No, she thought. This is it. She had to face this. With trembling hands, she raised the talisman in front of her, feeling the faint warmth as the bones of the charm seemed to come alive beneath her fingers. She didn't know if it was the talisman itself or the forest's power, but something inside her stirred, something that demanded she stand her ground. Face the forest. She repeated the words silently in her mind, drawing strength from them. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, as though the forest was alive, moving around her. The trees creaked and groaned, their branches twisting and bending as if in response to an unseen force. The air grew colder, the weight of it thick with the presence of something ancient and malevolent. Emma stepped forward, her legs shaking, but she didn't stop. Her eyes darted from shadow to shadow, scanning the area for any sign of the creature. And then there it was, a low growl, a rumble that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. It echoed through the trees, vibrating the ground beneath her feet. Emma froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The creature was close, but she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. With a steadying breath, she stepped forward again, moving deeper into the forest. She could feel the creature's presence, its eyes on her, but she refused to look back. She wouldn't be prey. Suddenly, the growl grew louder, closer, until it was almost deafening. The ground shook beneath her feet, and Emma stumbled, her body thrown off balance. She fought to stay upright, to keep moving forward, but the force pressing against her felt like nothing she had ever experienced. And then, through the fog of terror, something stepped from the shadows. It was massive, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light, but its eyes glowed with an unnatural, sickly yellow light. The creature was hulking, its form shifting like smoke, as though it existed in a state between reality and nightmare. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim light. Emma's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't back down. She clenched the talisman tightly in her hand, raising it as she had seen in the legends. She could feel the power of the charm flowing through her, responding to the creature's presence. The creature snarled, its growl turning into a bone-chilling hiss. It lunged forward, its claws swiping through the air, but Emma was ready. She thrust the talisman forward, the sharp bone pressing into the creature's path. For a moment the world seemed to freeze. The creature's eyes widened, its claws stopped mid-air, and Emma felt a surge of power course through her body. The talisman was working. The creature screeched, a sound so horrendous it shook the very trees around her. It recoiled, its form twisting and distorting, as if the talisman was burning it, pulling it back into the shadows. Emma didn't hesitate. She pressed forward, the words of the legends filling her mind, her voice steady as she spoke the ancient incantation she had memorized. The air around her shimmered, the trees groaning in protest, as the talisman's power seemed to resonate with the very soul of the forest. The creature writhed, its form flickering between shapes, like it was struggling against an invisible force. And then, with a final, desperate screech, the creature vanished into the shadows, leaving only the echo of its haunting cry behind. Emma stood in the clearing, gasping for air, her heart pounding in her chest. The forest was still again, but she knew it wasn't over. The forest was still alive, and there were other creatures out there, other things waiting in the darkness. But she had survived. For now, she turned away from the spot where the creature had vanished, her eyes scanning the trees. The forest was shifting again, the shadows closing in, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She had faced the forest, and she had won. For the first time that night, Emma felt the pull of the distant world beyond the forest, the world where people lived, where she could be free. She wasn't sure how she had done it, or how long she had been trapped in the woods, but she knew one thing. She had earned her escape. The creature was gone. The forest was quiet, and Emma was ready to leave. The path ahead was faint, almost imperceptible, but Emma could see it now, the first rays of daylight breaking through the dense canopy of trees. She had been walking for what felt like an eternity, her body aching, her mind reeling from the horrors she had faced in Black Hollow Forest. But as the light grew brighter, she allowed herself a moment to believe that she was finally leaving it all behind. The forest, which had once felt like a living, breathing entity, now seemed to retreat, the oppressive darkness lifting. The air was lighter, the sounds of nature returning to their usual rhythms. Birds called to one another, and the rustling of leaves was no longer an ominous whisper but a peaceful murmur. Yet, deep inside her, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching her, that it wasn't truly gone. She stumbled forward, her feet dragging with exhaustion. Her thoughts were a blur, but she kept her eyes on the horizon, where the first signs of civilization flickered in the distance. The memory of the creature's eyes, its haunting presence, still burned in her mind, but she couldn't allow herself to dwell on it. She had to keep moving. I made it out. I'm almost there. She repeated the thought to herself as though it were a mantra, willing it to be true. It wasn't long before she emerged from the shadows of the trees, stepping onto a dirt road that wound through the woods. The familiar sight of the path brought her a surge of relief, but also unease. Was she really free? Her heart still raced as she walked along the road, the early morning light casting long shadows on the ground. The forest loomed behind her, dark and silent, like a vast wall of memories she couldn't outrun. But now at least she could breathe. As Emma walked, she heard the distant hum of an engine. A car, perhaps. Hope surged in her chest, and she quickened her pace, knowing that the road would eventually lead her to someone, to safety. It wasn't long before a truck appeared on the horizon, its headlights cutting through the fog of the early morning. Emma raised her hand, her arms trembling from fatigue, but her determination pushed her to keep going. She was almost there. The truck pulled up beside her, the engine idling as the driver rolled down the window. He was an older man, his weathered face marked with years of hard work, but there was something kind in his eyes. "You look like you've seen hell, girl," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. Emma's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. The words tumbled out in a rush. "Please, I need help. I was trapped in the forest. Something is out there." She paused, her voice shaking. "It almost killed me." The man's eyes narrowed as he looked her over, a deep frown creasing his brow. "I've heard stories of that forest. Folks say it's cursed, something dark living in there. But I never thought they were true." Emma didn't know what to say to that. She wasn't sure she even believed it herself. Not anymore. She had faced the nightmare, survived it, and now she was out. But was she really free? The man hesitated before nodding. "All right, hop in. I'll take you to the nearest town. You look like you could use some rest." Emma didn't hesitate. She slid into the passenger seat, her body finally succumbing to the exhaustion she had been pushing away for so long. The warmth of the truck was a stark contrast to the cold grip of the forest, and for the first time in hours, Emma let herself relax. As the truck rumbled down the road, she glanced over her shoulder, her eyes lingering on the distant trees. She could have sworn she saw something moving between the trunks, something that shouldn't have been there. Her breath caught in her throat, but when she turned back, there was nothing. The man glanced at her, noting her tense posture. "You all right back there?" Emma forced a smile, trying to shake off the feeling that the forest was still there, still watching. "Yeah," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm fine." But even as she spoke the words, a part of her wasn't so sure. The memories of the creature, of the darkness that had tried to swallow her whole, were still fresh in her mind. The talisman was still clenched tightly in her hand, its warmth faint but present. She had escaped, yes, but there was something the man didn't know. Something that lingered in the deepest corners of her soul. The forest wasn't done with her. It had never been just a place. It was a presence, and it would find its way back to her. You made it to the end. But before you rush to the safety of your own reality, take a moment. Was Emma truly free? Did the forest really let her go, or will it always haunt her? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and share. Tell us, what do you think Emma's fate will be? And be sure to subscribe for more terrifying tales that will keep you up at night. Until next time, remember, the darkness is always watching, waiting,